You may have heard that recently Facebook essentially banned the entire country of Australia from posting content. Now, not Australian citizens, but basically government services, businesses, news outlets. I don't know exactly how many different industries were affected, but news organizations and a bunch of other peripheral websites were blocked. Their posts were all gone. Their pages were wiped clean. Facebook flexed its muscles and told Australia, you try to regulate us? F you. They shut it all down. Now, at first, they said, look, Australia passed this law where they want us to pay news providers when we host their content because someone shared it. That's not our fault. Someone else shared it. Don't look at us. They don't have the Section 230 protections. I don't know if that would necessarily protect them in that regard, but it might. So basically, Facebook would have to pay every time someone tweeted a link to an article. And they said, nah, we ain't doing it. We're going to shut the whole thing down. Well, this is amazing. Facebook has come to an agreement. After strong-arming Australia, they've caved for the most part. Facebook will now decide who they do pay and who they don't, and it carves out basically the ability for Facebook to ban news organizations who disagree with them. Let me break this down for you, and then I'll read the story. Just to give you the quick gist. What it sounds like is going on. Facebook, one, the Australian government is cowering in fear behind this monolith because too much of their economy is now intertwined into Facebook services. Too many businesses rely on it for advertising. Many businesses operate on Facebook entirely, like news and video. What Facebook is now doing is saying that they will have a legitimate path towards getting rid of any news outlet who dares oppose them, while pushing money towards those who say what they want. It's not necessarily a grand victory for Facebook because they could already do this, but now they've basically got the rubber stamp of approval from the Australian government to do this. Congratulations, citizens of Australia. Mark Zuckerberg is now your supreme chancellor. Because if you don't know what's going on, you can't vote properly. Mark Zuckerberg can just determine what news outlets get funded and which ones get deleted. And the information you see will be chosen by the Zuck himself. Congratulations. The nightmare dystopia only gets worse. Let's read the story from Daily Mail. Facebook claims it can pick and choose who it pays after Australia caves in over news blockade. They say Facebook claims it will have the power to pick and choose who it pays for news after Australia's new media laws come into force, handing the company a powerful weapon in its fight over paid content. Campbell Brown, Facebook's vice president of news partnerships, said Australian ministers assured him today the site will be free to support the publishers we choose after new bargaining laws are voted into force later this week. The rule could allow Facebook to ban companies demanding higher prices for their news while using cheaper rivals, a significant loophole in legislation that was designed to level the playing field between tech firms and publishers. It could also allow Facebook to block news outlets who are critical of the site, though the final deal has yet to be published. This is basically the government of Australia saying, we will in no way stop Facebook from taking over public discourse in our country. And I can only imagine something similar will happen here. Google has been a target of many journalists and leftists because, many of these leftists, not like the core leftists, but many establishment type lefties just fall in line behind their media overlords. They've been targeting Google and Facebook saying, you guys are making money off us. Now, to be fair, they kind of are. Let me break this down for you because Facebook and Google are a very serious problem. They created the problem and now they're offering a solution which only empowers them more and turns news outlets into subservient entities of these platforms. Back in the day, if you wanted to read the news, you had to go to the news. You had to go to New York Times, CNN, whatever, trash outlet you read, I guess. Fox News, maybe. And you'd read what they had to say. Well, then Google started scraping websites and the content of many of these news articles just appeared in the search, which made it so that a lot of people didn't have to click the links anymore and actually go to these sites. They started losing money. Google started making money because then instead of selling ad revenue on news websites, Google started selling ad space instead of getting ad revenue. So Google started getting the ad revenue that once went to news organizations. News organizations complained about this. Here we are now. The deal is basically these news outlets are going to bend the knee to Mark Zuckerberg in exchange for some cash. Zuckerberg, Facebook, can determine how much they're going to give out and who they're going to ban outright on monetary grounds. It's just a new path for Facebook to say, here's why we removed this person legitimately, because they didn't agree to our terms on pay. So that's it. Another way that they are going to take away your voice, your right to post. Independent news organizations will not be allowed to flourish. And that's Facebook just winning. They say, Mr. Brown spoke out as CEO Mark Zuckerberg agreed to end a week-long blockade of news in Australia after ministers significantly watered down laws designed to force the site to pay for news content it hosts. The concessions will have global ramifications. The UK, EU, and US are all considering whether to pass similar rules, but will now find it much harder to go beyond the precedent set in Australia. Nevertheless, Australian Treasurer Josh Fryberg painted the move as a victory, saying Facebook will now negotiate deals to pay for content, albeit with a stronger negotiating hand than it had last week. UK Culture Committee Chairman Julian Knight, who had called for social networks to be brought to heel, that's HEEL, after Facebook blocked news in Australia, told the Mail Online, we need to see more details of this deal. It leaves more question than answers. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that Facebook has behaved very poorly. Unfriending an entire continent is clearly unacceptable. I hope that Facebook gets the message loud and clear. There's a long way to go to restore an increasingly tarnished reputation. You know what? Dude, they own you. They control what you think. They can dictate what you will see. You're not going to have an opportunity to actually share ideas and argue for your own politics when you are beholden to what Facebook allows. Facebook's going to go, oh no, we're going to allow this publication to post at a cheap rate. So here's what you end up getting. Facebook can effectively say, this news outlet is too expensive, so we won't allow it. Fox News, The Sun, whatever, gone. Then you get these powerful and prominent outlets that can afford it. Facebook says, we're going to give you a pretty penny. Once again, the nightmare dystopia is just pushing forward as Facebook used the weight of their power to shut down competition. We've seen something not too dissimilar happening here in the U.S., and I think the direction we're going is going to be absolute control of speech. It's going to be, look, Politico wrote about this. I talked about it yesterday. Democrats question TV carriers' decisions to host Fox, OAN, and Newsmax, citing misinformation. What they're trying to do, the establishment, is, in a sense, create a monoculture, a monolithic, singular worldview among the U.S. or among probably the world. And what this means is that your ability to speak freely, to challenge the lies and the misinformation, will be stripped away. It's not just happening at the governmental level. It's also happening at the social level. In the U.S., we have a First Amendment right. Facebook does have some constraints, but they do have a lot of protections. In fact, they have more protections here than they would in a place like Australia because of Section 230. Australia doesn't have that. So theoretically, people could sue Facebook. Not that I think they'd win because, Facebook's too powerful. But in the U.S., this kind of manipulation and monolithic thought policing is coming at the social level and from private companies. And that's technically the truth in the UK and Canada and Australia as well. That's literally what we're talking about. Facebook's grown so powerful that Australia is basically getting on bent knee and saying, please, please don't hurt us again. And what we see in the US is that if you do something wrong, if you said something wrong 10 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there's no apologizing. There's no acceptance. You did it. It's done. And they will destroy you. It's almost like a sorting algorithm, as it were. The idea being that the only people who are allowed to be working are those who are sufficiently woke and have never said a naughty word in their lives. And then everyone else, I guess, is just part of the underclass. Now, part of me actually, part of this, it makes me actually optimistic. There's only so much you can do before you lose the majority. Right now, the ultra woke that bend the knee and cheer on the massive private corporations, they're essentially fascistic. I don't want to say fascist because they're not necessarily nationalist, but they're super fascistic, right? They love big private corporations stomping all over people's individual rights to expression and then say, but my private company. Yeah, private companies stomping over someone's rights in the public space. Not a good thing. Facebook clearly has a monopoly or it's part of a duopoly with Google, but they can clearly cause massive damage to an entire country. But I do have some optimism. I want to show you this story, which is, first let me pull up this one. Trevor Tim, in reference to the Politico story, says, barely anyone is grappling with the fact that much of the misinformation posted to social networks is protected speech, and Congress may be violating the First Amendment by issuing threats to tech companies over it. And that's why one of the reasons I get fairly optimistic. The U.S. has certain protections, and that's a good thing. But I'm also optimistic because of ridiculous stories like this. From The Defector, Slate podcast host Mike Pesca suspended following internal discussion about use of a slur. Okay, let me break this story down for you. This guy, Mike Pesca, hosts the Slate podcast, or one of them, which is a leftist podcast. He was having an internal Slack discussion where he said, in certain descriptive contexts, such as quoting someone, the use of the N-word, should be allowed. Now, the problem I have right here is a lot of people don't seem to understand this because maybe they didn't think about it. There's more than one word that is referred to in that way. And I'm not referring to, a bunch of people posted jokes saying like Nabisco and nationalism. And I'm like, no. Quite literally, there are 3 different versions, I believe, off the top of my head, of the slur, the N-word. So I'm curious as to what was this guy actually saying. I don't know because they did not tell us the word he said. There are 3. And there's probably more, I guess. There's 3 different iterations of a similar word. And I can't say it on YouTube. Like any iteration of that word for any context, for any reason, gone. I should walk that back. It's not necessarily true. It's more of a social pressure where they will try and destroy you and strip your ads away for saying it. Google will actually let you say it. I'm not going to because, let me put it this way. This article conflates the statement, saying the word in a descriptive context with literally using it. And so they tell people that you were using the slur, which it kind of implies you were you're actually deriding someone, actually using it to target them, when in fact you were describing it. So this guy gets fired. But again, let me tell you why I'm hopeful, and then I'll read you what happened. Facebook can keep doing things like this, but all that's happening in its wake are people making their own websites. Hence, I started timcast.com. We're signing up members and doing exclusive episodes where we can have discussions like this without fear of getting banned. It's our own website. Now, don't get me wrong. You can actually still get banned from your own website if the server hosting or DNS or Google or whatever come after you. But for the most part, that doesn't really happen right now. There's more leeway. Because of what Facebook is doing, I got to be honest, people are trying to find other ways to communicate. They're using different apps. They're using Instagram. Not Instagram. They're using Telegram and Signal. And this is causing outrage among these woke leftists like, they're getting misinformation now in private. Yeah, too bad. People can use private communications. As for the Slate podcast, let me just ask you. This dude was having an honest, good faith discussion over quoting people who have said the N-word, notably people like James Baldwin, a renowned civil rights hero, super smart guy. He was awesome. I've watched a ton of his speeches. I've seen tons of his debates. That dude was amazing. And he frequently used a version of the N-word that was particularly common back then that we aren't allowed to say on YouTube or just in general society. And so what ends up happening is when this Slate guy's having this debate and they fired him for it. How long? Look, this guy's a lefty. This guy hates Trump. This guy seems to be like he works for Slate. Slate is lefty. He doesn't seem to be a fan of Trump. Where's he going to go now? You see, what's happening is the purity testing and the lack of tolerance for any kind of actual debate is destroying the left. The censorship, the refusal to allow people to speak and share ideas is resulting in an opposite reaction. So that's where these two stories kind of come together. Facebook can ban Australia and they can try and pull this stuff, but people are going to find other ways to share news. They're going to use competition. They're going to make their own websites. They're going to have their own websites. They're going to create networks between decentralized, systems to create an unbannable internet. With this, Slate particularly, this dude's going to find a job with a more moderate, ideology, I suppose. And they're going to say, we understand why you might say the N-word. Now, listen, I think the use of racial slurs against people is wrong. It's abhorrent. I think racism is disgusting. I also think that you can make racist jokes like Family Guy does every single day. And we understand it's mocking the stereotypes, not trying to assert them. I think Family Guy and South Park do a great job of making fun of the uptight BS. But we live in a society right now where you will be socially ostracized if in any context you do say these slurs. Here's the story. The Hill says, Slate has suspended Mike Pesca, host of the podcast The Gist, after he debated whether non-black people should be allowed to quote certain racial slurs with colleagues. The New York Times reports that Pesca, who is white, was suspended indefinitely after getting into a debate on Slack regarding Times reporter Donald McNeil, who was recently suspended for repeatedly saying the N-word during a 2019 student trip. The issue is, this journalist guy, he wasn't calling people the N-word. He was apparently explaining racial slurs. My understanding is that he was telling people why it was wrong. So much like that story with Netflix a couple of years ago, where an executive was literally giving a list of things you can't say, and they're like, how dare you say those words? You have this guy who was saying, we need to be allowed to do it. This is crazy. This is a cascade effect. Check this out. This journalist apparently was giving some kind of descriptive use of a slur, so the New York Times fired him. So another podcast host on the left is saying, I think you should be allowed to do it, so they fired him. Keep firing these people. Eventually, you'll have no one left on your side. That's the point. Keep banning our ability to communicate, Facebook. Eventually, people will find other ways to do it. I've said this over and over again. It goes back to when Patreon banned Carl Benjamin, a.k.a. Sargon of Akkad, of the Lotus Eaters podcast. And they banned him outright, with no warning, with no chance for apology, nothing. And I said, listen, if you got this guy on your podcast, or on your platform, and he's saying something you don't like, if you ban him, what's his incentive to stop saying these things? He'll just keep doing it. Why? He's already lost the platform. He's not scared of you anymore. But if you're providing a service, like he's on this platform, you could say, hey, bro, please, I understand the context, and I think your use of it was inappropriate. Don't do that again. And he would have been like, you got it. Yeah, okay, I get it. I could make my point better. I'll say something else. I won't say it. In which case, you actually have the influence. What's happening now with the firing and suspension of the things that Facebook is doing, and don't get me wrong, what Facebook is gaining here is massively powerful. But like I said, it makes me kind of optimistic in the end, because I think it's going to create a pressure which forces people to create alternate platforms. So I'll tell you one of the things I want to work on. We have timcast.com, but one of my goals ultimately is to create a larger brand that can be more of a decentralized network, individuals who are moderate left, moderate right, not staunch conservatives, not traditional, just like kind of anti-establishment individuals of varying political ideologies can have real debates. And that can be a place where we don't got to worry about being banned. I also want to create some kind of open source social networking technology that can plug in to individual websites, effectively creating a decentralized social network through all of these different platforms. So if you post an article to your website, we can have a parent hub that just feeds a bunch of different topics and basically functions like Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, but it's a directory, not a hosting service. Don't actually host the content. That's expensive anyway. Then no one can be banned. That's what I want to see. This guy got fired from his job because, let me read a little bit more. Pesca reportedly argued that there were contexts in which the slur could be used. No, which could be quoted. That's the important way to phrase it. Dan Check, Slate's chief executive, quickly stopped the discussion, saying, while I can't get into specific allegations that are under investigation, I can confirm this was not a decision based around making an isolated abstract argument in a Slack channel. For those that aren't familiar, Slack is like Discord, but for businesses. According to the Times, Pesca said he was heartsick over hurting his colleagues while adding, I hate the idea of things that are beyond debate and things that cannot be said. Joel Anderson, who hosted a season of Slate's Slow Burn podcast and is black, shot back at insinuations that Pesca's suspension was an overreaction, saying, for black employees, it's an extremely small ask not to hear that particular slur and not have debate about whether it's okay for white employees to use that particular slur. You see what they're doing here? They're conflating the use of it with the explanation of it. So here's my ultimate problem. Just as kind of an aside on the bigger picture. I don't know what word was being said. Like I stated, there are 3 different direct iterations of that particular word. And I can't say any one of them. Some are, one is particularly egregious. One is considered acceptable in colloquial contexts among certain people. And one was extremely prevalent and exists today in modern usage. Even there's a documentary that uses one of these words. Can't say what they are. You can't say them. That's the issue where we don't actually know what's going on because people can't say what he said. I'm not saying to call someone a word. I'm saying I don't know what word you're talking about. And there lies the problem. People like this lefty Mike Pesca guy, he's going to keep working. He's going to keep existing. And he's going to be angry over the idea that he lost his job for saying we need to talk about what this means. The aftermath of the big tech censorship has been Parler, Gab. Gab's particularly resilient. There's now calls among the right to create a new internet that preserves the freedom, our individual freedoms, because too many companies got woke and maybe now will go broke. And then on the flip side, too many companies, in response to this, firing people, terminating them. You're going to create large groups of people who want freedom, who will build the infrastructure to do it. So I'll put it this way. Facebook may have gained this massive power. But in the end, I think people are going to say, I'm not going to pay you, or I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept your terms. Facebook will say, we refuse to allow you on our platform. And they'll say, well, then I'll make my own platform or find my own way to do it. Already, you have platforms like Minds and BitChute and Gab and Parler. And people use them and communicate on them. And they work. They're not nearly as big, but does it really matter? I understand that these big tech platforms essentially have monopolized public discourse. But what I mean when I say does it really matter is in the long run. This is why I'm more optimistic on this. While I can certainly complain that right now we need some kind of regulatory protections because they might try to shut down these other institutions, which they've been doing, I think you can't stop the tide. Too many people are facing this kind of absurdity. Getting fired for having a discussion around contextual uses of certain words is insane. If the dude literally went up to somebody of a certain race and used a slur, I'd be like, even then, no joke, you have to issue a warning. However, as much as I try to be reasonable in terms of legal context, if he walked up to somebody who's a slur, I'd be like, bye-bye, you're out. Get out of here, dude. We don't want any of that nasty stuff in here. It's awful. But he didn't do that. Where's this guy going to go? The people who are being fired over this stuff are going to be the ones who build the new culture, the new infrastructure, who populate new websites and say, we should be allowed to speak. So long story short, these platforms, these businesses, they're burning themselves to the ground. We'll see, though. It's hard to know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic, depending on what the news is, but I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast, which is a different YouTube channel. Just type it in. You'll see it. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.